When the car broke down in the middle of the woods, I thought my biggest challenge would be making it through the storm. But what happens when one night reveals the cracks in everything you thought you knew? Your marriage, your loyalty, and even yourself. This isn't just a story about a broken car. It's about a moment that changed my life forever. What would you do when faced with a decision that could destroy everything or set you free? Before we dive into this unforgettable story, make sure to subscribe for more gripping tales like this one, and let me know in the comments, where are you watching this from? I'd love to hear from you. When the engine sputtered and finally gave out, I thought it was just another minor inconvenience. I had no idea that night would change my life forever. The rain was coming down in sheets, drenching the windshield and smearing the beams of the headlights into a blurry haze. The rhythmic pounding of raindrops was the only sound, aside from the faint hum of the dying engine. My boss, Daniel, slammed his hands on the steering wheel and let out a frustrated sigh. "Looks like we're stuck," he said, his voice tinged with irritation but calm as always. I sat there frozen for a moment, clutching my phone and staring at the screen. No bars. Typical. Just typical. The GPS had stopped working an hour ago, and now, miles away from the nearest town, we were stranded. Daniel glanced at me, his green eyes catching the faint light of the dashboard. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I lied, trying to shake off the growing pit in my stomach. "Just annoyed." This was supposed to be a quick trip back home. "Yeah, well, plans change," he muttered, popping the hood and stepping out into the rain. I watched him through the fogged-up window, his broad shoulders hunched against the downpour as he inspected the engine. It wasn't hard to see why so many people admired Daniel. He had a commanding presence, the kind that made you feel safe, even in moments like this. But tonight, as he disappeared behind the hood of the car, I felt anything but safe. The tension between us had been building for weeks, ever since the late nights at the office started to feel less like work and more like something else. I'd catch him looking at me just a second too long. His compliments became more personal, less about my performance and more about me. I hated myself for how much I craved that attention. After 5 years of marriage, my husband barely noticed me anymore. I'd walk into a room and he wouldn't even glance up from his phone. But Daniel? He saw me. I shook the thoughts away as Daniel climbed back into the car, his hair plastered to his forehead. "Bad news," he said, running a hand through his soaked hair. "The engine's dead. We're not going anywhere tonight." "Fantastic," I muttered, slumping in my seat. He chuckled softly. "Look on the bright side. At least we're not in a horror movie. No creepy cabin in the woods to deal with." His joke fell flat and we sat in silence for a moment. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, the way it lingered just a little too long. "There's an emergency flashlight in the trunk," he said finally. "We should find some kind of shelter. Can't stay in the car all night." I nodded, grabbing my coat and stepping out into the storm. The cold rain soaked through my clothes instantly, chilling me to the bone. Daniel grabbed the flashlight and motioned for me to follow. The woods were dark and uninviting, the tall trees swaying in the wind like shadowy figures. Every snap of a twig underfoot made me jump, my nerves already stretched thin. "Relax," Daniel said, his voice low and reassuring. "We'll find something." We walked in silence, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. I tried to focus on the sound of our footsteps, the rain, anything to distract myself from the gnawing tension between us. After what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon a small cabin. It was old and decrepit, the kind of place you'd expect to find in a ghost story. But it was shelter. "Looks like our creepy cabin," Daniel joked, flashing me a grin. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at my lips. He always knew how to lighten the mood, even in the worst situations. Inside, the cabin was musty and dark, but at least it was dry. Daniel lit a small lantern he found on a dusty shelf, casting a warm glow across the room. There was a single wooden table, a couple of rickety chairs, and a threadbare couch pushed against the wall. "Home sweet home," he said, shrugging off his wet jacket. I sat down on the couch, my body aching from the cold and exhaustion. Daniel rummaged through the supplies he'd brought from the car, eventually pulling out a bottle of wine and 2 plastic cups. "Figured we could use this," he said, holding it up with a sheepish smile. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. Why not? Might as well make the best of it. We sat there in the dim light, sipping wine and talking about everything and nothing. For the first time in what felt like years, I laughed. Really laughed. "You're different when you're not in the office," I said, surprising even myself with the honesty. He raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "More relaxed. Human, I guess." He chuckled. "That's because I don't have a million things to juggle right now. But you're always the same. Steady, reliable. It's impressive." I looked away, his words hitting a little too close to home. "I don't always feel steady." "No?" he asked, his tone softer now. "You seem like you have it all together." I let out a bitter laugh. Appearances can be deceiving. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain pounded against the roof, and the silence between us grew heavier. "You deserve to feel seen, you know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat. The way he was looking at me, like I was the only person in the world, was almost too much to bear. "I think," he started, but then shook his head, letting the words hang in the air. I didn't trust myself to speak. All I could do was sit there, my heart racing, as the line between professional and personal blurred into something unrecognizable. The silence stretched between us, heavy and electric. The wine, though cheap and overly sweet, was working its way into my veins, loosening the tension in my shoulders and making the room feel a little warmer. Still, I couldn't shake the way Daniel had looked at me, his green eyes full of something unspoken but undeniable. "I should probably call my husband," I blurted, breaking the quiet. My voice sounded louder than I intended in the small cabin. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, good idea. He's probably worried." I pulled my phone out of my bag, but the screen remained blank. Still no service. Of course, I held it up as if the pathetic gesture would summon a signal from the ether, then sighed and set it back down. "No luck?" he asked, his voice soft. "Nothing," I replied, leaning back on the couch. He's used to me being late anyway. Probably assumes I'm stuck in traffic. Daniel tilted his head, studying me with that same quiet intensity he always did when he thought I wasn't looking. "Doesn't seem like he worries much about you." I bristled, my defenses shooting up instinctively. "That's not true. He cares." "Sure," Daniel said, his tone neutral. "Didn't mean anything by it." But the seed had been planted, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of it. It wasn't that my husband didn't care, he did, in his own way. But somewhere along the line, we had fallen into a routine that felt more like cohabitation than partnership. Conversations revolved around grocery lists and bills. Date nights were a thing of the past. And when was the last time he'd even looked at me? The way Daniel just had. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. "What about you?" I asked, changing the subject. "No girlfriend waiting up for you?" Daniel smirked, swirling the wine in his cup. "Not anymore. Work doesn't leave much time for that kind of thing." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that your excuse? Or theirs?" His laugh was low and self-deprecating. A little of both, probably. For the first time that night, I allowed myself to really look at him. His tie was gone, and the top few buttons of his shirt were undone, revealing the faint outline of his collarbone. His dark hair was still damp from the rain, and the lines around his eyes softened when he smiled. There was an ease to him here, away from the pressures of the office, that was both disarming and dangerous. "It's funny," I said, more to myself than to him, "how different someone can seem when you take them out of their usual context." Daniel arched an eyebrow. "Different how?" I hesitated, suddenly unsure if I should continue, but the wine, coupled with the strange intimacy of the situation, emboldened me. "You're warmer, I guess. Less intimidating." He laughed again, a real, genuine laugh that lit up his entire face. "I'll take that as a compliment, but don't let it fool you. I'm still the same guy who'll send you 15 emails before 9 a.m. "Good to know," I said, smiling despite myself. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind howling against the windows and the rain drumming on the roof. The warmth of the cabin felt more pronounced in contrast, wrapping around me like a cocoon. I wasn't sure if it was the wine or the company, but the tension I'd been holding on to all day began to ease. Daniel leaned back in his chair, stretching his long legs out in front of him. "You know, this isn't exactly how I pictured tonight going." "Yeah? What did you picture?" I asked, genuinely curious. He shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Definitely not sitting in a creepy cabin in the middle of the woods. Maybe unwinding with a drink at home, catching up on some emails." "That's your idea of unwinding?" I teased. "Running a company, yeah," he replied, his smile turning wry. "But I guess this isn't so bad. Could be worse, right?" "Could be a lot worse," I agreed. "At least we have wine and shelter and—" I trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. "And?" he prompted, his voice low. I met his gaze, the weight of it nearly knocking the air out of me. "And company," I finished softly. His expression shifted, the playful smirk giving way to something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had narrowed to just the two of us, the storm outside fading into background noise. "You're right," he said after a beat, his voice barely above a whisper. "Could be a lot worse." Neither of us moved. The air between us crackled with unspoken words, unacknowledged feelings. I knew I should look away, should say something to break the spell, but I couldn't. I was frozen, caught in the pull of his gaze. And then, as if realizing the moment had stretched too long, Daniel cleared his throat and stood. "I should check the firewood, make sure we have enough to get through the night." I nodded, the spell broken, and watched as he grabbed the flashlight and disappeared out the door. The cabin suddenly felt colder, emptier without him. I leaned back against the couch, closing my eyes and letting out a long, shaky breath. What was I doing? This was my boss. My married, professional self had no business feeling whatever it was I was feeling. And yet, I couldn't deny the pull, the way his presence seemed to fill the empty spaces I didn't even realize I had. When Daniel returned a few minutes later, his arms full of wood, he didn't say anything. But the way his eyes lingered on me as he set the logs by the fireplace told me everything I needed to know. I should have been afraid of what it meant, what it could mean if I let this go any further. But instead, as the fire crackled to life and cast a warm glow across the room, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Alive. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the cabin with a soft, golden light. The storm raged on outside, the wind howling like a wild animal. But inside, it was quiet, almost too quiet. I sat cross-legged on the couch, staring into the flames as they danced and twisted, lost in my thoughts. Daniel moved about the cabin with an ease that felt out of place in the unfamiliar setting, his movements purposeful but unhurried. "Still no signal?" he asked, nodding toward my phone. I shook my head. "Dead as ever. I guess we're officially off the grid." He smiled faintly, settling into the chair opposite me with another glass of wine in hand. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Forces us to slow down for once." "True," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Slowing down meant facing things I'd been trying to avoid, feelings I wasn't ready to name, let alone act on. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the rain pounding against the roof and the occasional pop of the fire. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was charged, like the air before a lightning strike. I could feel his eyes on me, studying me, and it took everything in me not to turn and meet his gaze. "You're quiet," he said finally, his voice soft but insistent. I shrugged, still staring into the fire. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how this night could have gone so differently," I admitted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Different how?" I hesitated, feeling the weight of his question pressing down on me. But the wine had loosened my tongue, and the storm outside made it feel like we were in a world all our own, separate from the rules and expectations of everyday life. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I wouldn't be here. Maybe I'd be home with my husband, pretending everything is fine." "Pretending?" he repeated, his tone gentle but probing. I nodded, still unable to look at him. "It's what we do. We go through the motions, say all the right things, but it's like we're living two separate lives under the same roof." Daniel was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was laced with something I couldn't quite place. "Sympathy? Anger? Understanding? You deserve more than that," he said simply. The words hit me like a physical blow. I finally turned to look at him, my eyes searching his face for some hint of what he meant. But his expression was unreadable, his green eyes steady and unwavering. "Daniel," I started, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Let me finish," he said, his voice firm but kind. "I've watched you work harder than anyone else in that office. You're dedicated, smart, and kind, and yet I see the way you look sometimes. Like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders and no one even notices." My throat tightened, and I looked away, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill. He was seeing right through me, cutting past the carefully constructed facade I wore like armor. "I notice," he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Those two words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I felt my pulse quicken, my breath coming faster as the tension that had been building all night reached its breaking point. "Daniel," I said again, my voice trembling. "This, whatever this is, we can't." "Why not?" he asked, leaning closer. "Because it's wrong? Because you're married? Or because you're scared of what it might mean if someone finally sees you?" His words were like a match to dry tinder, igniting something inside me that I'd been trying to suppress for so long. I stood abruptly, putting as much distance between us as the small cabin allowed. "You don't understand," I said, my voice shaking. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is," he countered, standing as well. "Maybe life doesn't have to be so complicated. Maybe just once you should let yourself feel something without analyzing it to death." I shook my head, wrapping my arms around myself as if to hold myself together. "I can't." "Can't? Or won't?" he pressed, stepping closer. I turned to face him, my back pressed against the wall. He was only a few feet away now, his presence overwhelming in the confined space. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." He reached out, his hand hovering near my face but not quite touching. "Then let me help you figure it out." I closed my eyes, torn between the warring parts of myself, the part that wanted to run, to cling to the safety of the life I knew, and the part that wanted to leap into the unknown. Consequences be damned. When I opened my eyes, he was still there, his expression open and earnest. Slowly, tentatively, I reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around mine, warm and steady, and in that moment, the storm outside seemed to fade into nothing. Neither of us moved for what felt like an eternity, the air between us thick with anticipation. And then, as if some invisible barrier had finally shattered, he pulled me into his arms. His lips found mine, soft and searching, and the world around us fell away. There was no past, no future, only this moment, this connection that felt as inevitable as the rain falling outside. His hands traced a path up my arms, his touch sending shivers down my spine. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. The morning light streamed through the dusty windows of the cabin, the storm having quieted in the early hours. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing as guilt clawed at the edges of my mind. My clothes were rumpled, my hair a mess, and I hadn't slept a wink. Across the room, Daniel was seated on a chair, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared into the embers of the dying fire. Neither of us had spoken since it happened. The memory of his touch was still fresh on my skin, and I could feel the warmth of his lips lingering on mine. But with every moment that passed, reality crept back in, bringing with it a flood of emotions I wasn't prepared to face. "You're quiet," Daniel said, breaking the silence. I sat up, smoothing my clothes as if that could somehow fix the mess I'd made of my life. "I don't know what to say." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's fair." The weight of his calm acceptance made it harder, not easier. Part of me wanted him to be angry, to demand answers or make some grand declaration that could absolve me of my guilt. Instead, he sat there, giving me space to process the unthinkable. "We should head back," I said, avoiding his gaze. "The rain's stopped. The tow truck should be able to find us now." "Yeah," he said simply, standing and gathering his things. The walk back to the car was silent, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot. The tension between us was palpable, and I could feel his eyes on me every now and then, but I didn't dare meet his gaze. I didn't trust myself to look at him without falling apart. When we reached the car, a wave of relief washed over me at the sight of the tow truck already parked nearby. The driver was leaning against the truck, his arms crossed as he surveyed the damage to Daniel's car. "Rough night?" he asked, his tone casual but curious. You could say that," Daniel replied, handing over the keys. I climbed into the passenger seat of the truck, grateful for the excuse to put some physical distance between us. Daniel slid in next to me, his shoulder brushing against mine as he settled into the cramped space. The contact sent a jolt through me, but I forced myself to focus on the road ahead, counting down the minutes until we'd be back in civilization, and I could escape this nightmare. When we finally reached the city, Daniel offered to drop me off at home. I hesitated, wanting nothing more than to avoid the confrontation waiting for me there. But running away wouldn't solve anything, and I knew I couldn't delay the inevitable. The car came to a stop in front of my house, and I turned to face him for the first time since we left the cabin. "Thank you," I said, my voice trembling. "For what?" he asked, his tone gentle. "For not making this harder than it already is." His lips curved into a sad smile. "That's the last thing I'd want to do." I nodded, my throat tight, and opened the door. As I stepped out, he reached for my hand, stopping me. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice low. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "You too." With that, I closed the door and walked up the steps to my house, my legs feeling like lead. Inside, the house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My husband's briefcase was by the door, his shoes neatly placed on the mat. The sight of them made my chest tighten, the weight of what I'd done crashing down on me all at once. I found him in the living room, sitting on the couch with his laptop open on his knees. He looked up when I walked in, his face lighting up with a smile that quickly faded when he saw the expression on mine. "Hey," he said, closing the laptop and setting it aside. "Everything okay?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "You're home late," he said, his brow furrowing. "Everything go all right with the trip?" "It was fine," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. He stood, crossing the room to stand in front of me. "You sure? You look off." I forced a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "Just tired. It was a long night." He studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. "Okay. Why don't you go lie down? I'll bring you some tea." The kindness in his voice was almost unbearable. I nodded again and headed to the bedroom, the guilt pressing down on me like a physical weight. For days, I avoided Daniel at work. I buried myself in tasks, arriving early and leaving late to minimize any chance of crossing paths. But the tension was impossible to ignore. When he finally cornered me in the break room one afternoon, I knew the confrontation I'd been dreading was inevitable. "We need to talk," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. I glanced around, making sure we were alone, and nodded. "Not here." He gestured toward his office, and I followed him inside, closing the door behind me. "I've been giving you space," he said, leaning against his desk, "but I need to know where we stand." I looked down at my hands, twisting them nervously. I don't know what I'm doing anymore." He stepped closer, his expression softening. "I'm not asking for anything, but I need to know if you regret it." The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Did I regret it? The answer was complicated. I regretted the pain it could cause, the betrayal of my vows, the lies I now had to live with. But the moment itself, the way he'd made me feel seen, wanted, that I couldn't regret. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely audible. He nodded, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. "Fair enough." The days stretched into weeks, and the space between us grew wider. At home, my husband tried to reconnect, his efforts sweet but clumsy. I wanted to believe we could find our way back to each other, but the shadow of that night in the woods loomed over everything. And at work, Daniel and I settled into a fragile truce, neither of us willing to push the boundaries we'd so recklessly crossed. But the question remained gnawing at the edges of my mind. Could I ever truly leave that night behind? The days turned into weeks, and the memory of that night in the woods lingered like a shadow in my mind. At home, my husband began to notice my distance. He would ask me if everything was okay, his tone a mix of concern and confusion. I always gave the same answer: "I'm just tired." But the truth was far more complicated. Tired wasn't the word for the hollow ache in my chest, or the knot of guilt tightening with every passing day. I couldn't shake the image of Daniel's eyes, the way they had seen me in a way my husband hadn't in years. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, my husband cleared his throat. "We need to talk." I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. "About what?" He set his utensils down and looked at me, his expression earnest. "About us. About whatever's been going on with you these past few weeks." "There's nothing going on," I said quickly, too quickly. He raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. I don't believe that. You've been distant, quiet, like you're somewhere else entirely. If there's something wrong, I need to know. The words caught in my throat. This was my moment to come clean, to lay everything out and face the consequences of my choices. But the thought of seeing his face crumble, of breaking the life we'd built together, was too much to bear. I'm just overwhelmed with work, I said finally, forcing a smile. It's nothing serious. His shoulders sagged with visible relief, and he reached across the table to take my hand. Okay, but if it ever becomes too much, I'm here. You know that, right? I nodded, the weight of my lies pressing down on me like a boulder. At work, things with Daniel had shifted. We'd fallen into an unspoken agreement to keep things strictly professional. He avoided my gaze during meetings, his tone with me cool and distant. It was what I had wanted, what I had needed to feel like I could move forward. But every now and then I'd catch him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment, only sadness. It was the kind of sadness that made my chest tighten because it mirrored my own. One afternoon, I stayed late to finish a project. The office was quiet, most of the staff having already gone home for the weekend. I was so absorbed in my work that I didn't notice Daniel standing in the doorway until he cleared his throat. I looked up, my heart skipping a beat. Oh, hi. Hi, he said, stepping inside. Didn't think anyone else was still here. Just trying to get a head start on next week, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He nodded, his hands shoved into his pockets. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us thick and heavy. I'm leaving the company, he said finally, his tone carefully neutral. I blinked, the words not registering at first. What? I got an offer from another firm. It's a good opportunity, and I think it's time for a change. The air seemed to leave the room all at once. Oh, I said, unable to hide the surprise in my voice. Wow, congratulations. Thanks, he said, his lips twitching into a small smile. I just thought you should hear it from me before the announcement goes out. Of course, I said, nodding. That's great. He hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but then he simply nodded and turned to leave. As the door clicked shut behind him, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, sadness, and something that felt alarmingly close to regret. A few days after Daniel's departure, my husband suggested we take a weekend trip together. Just the two of us, he said, his eyes bright with hope. We could use a little getaway. I agreed, partly out of guilt and partly because I wanted to believe we could find our way back to each other. The cabin he rented was nothing like the one Daniel and I had found. It was cozy and well kept, with large windows that overlooked a serene lake. The air was crisp and cool, and the leaves had turned shades of orange and gold, painting the landscape in warm hues. We spent the days hiking, cooking together, and sitting by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of the connection we used to have. But at night, as I lay in bed beside him, my mind drifted back to that stormy night in the woods. I couldn't help but wonder what might have been had things gone differently. On the final morning of our trip, I woke early and stepped outside to watch the sunrise. The lake was calm, the surface like glass, reflecting the vibrant colors of the dawn sky. As I stood there, wrapped in a blanket, my husband joined me, his arms encircling my waist. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice soft. "Yeah," I said, leaning into him. For a moment, I let myself believe that everything could be okay, that we could move past the lies, the guilt, and the distance that had crept between us. But deep down I knew the truth. The cracks in our relationship might never fully heal, no matter how hard we tried. And the memory of that night in the woods would always be there, a reminder of the choices I had made and the person I had become. The weeks following our trip were quiet, almost too quiet. My husband seemed lighter, more at ease, as if our weekend away had convinced him that everything between us was fine. But I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in my chest, the weight of what I was hiding. At work, Daniel's absence was like a phantom limb. His office, now occupied by someone new, felt foreign. The company moved on without him, but I couldn't. Every time I walked past that door, I felt a pang of something I couldn't name. Loss, guilt, longing. One day, as I sorted through my emails, a message from Daniel appeared in my inbox. My heart skipped a beat as I clicked it open. Subject: checking in. I hope you're doing well. I wanted to thank you again for everything you brought to the team. The transition here has been smooth, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss working with you. Take care of yourself. Daniel. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. His words were simple, professional even, but they stirred something inside me. I thought about replying, but every time I tried to type a response, the words felt wrong. Eventually, I closed the email and resolved to let it sit unanswered. At home, my husband was more attentive than ever, as if sensing the fragility of our relationship but not fully understanding its cause. He started planning small surprises: flowers on the kitchen table, dinner reservations at my favorite restaurant, even a handwritten note tucked into my purse that simply said, "I love you." I wanted to believe it was enough. I wanted to feel the same spark I had felt when we were younger, when love was effortless. But no matter how hard I tried, the shadow of that night in the woods lingered. One evening, as we sat together watching TV, he turned to me, his expression serious. "Are you happy?" he asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. "You ask that," I said, stalling. He shrugged, his eyes never leaving mine. "I don't know. You just seem distant lately, like you're here but not really here." I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I looked away, the weight of his gaze too much to bear. "Is there something you're not telling me?" he pressed, his voice soft but insistent. The question hung in the air, and I felt my chest tighten. This was it. The moment I had been avoiding for weeks. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. His brow furrowed, and he reached out to take my hand. "Whatever it is, we can work through it. I just need to know the truth." The truth. I took a deep breath, the words teetering on the edge of my tongue. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw the man I had once fallen in love with, the man who, despite everything, still believed in us. "I'm just tired," I said finally, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. He nodded, his grip on my hand tightening. "Then let me help. Whatever it takes, we'll figure it out together." The following weekend, I drove out to the woods alone. I told my husband I needed some time to myself, and he didn't question it. The cabin where Daniel and I had spent that stormy night was still there, though it looked even more decrepit in the harsh light of day. The memories came flooding back as I stepped inside, the air heavy with the scent of damp wood and forgotten promises. I sat on the couch, staring at the cold, empty hearth. For the first time in weeks, I let myself feel everything: the guilt, the longing, the fear. I thought about my husband, his unwavering kindness, and the way he was trying so hard to make things right. And I thought about Daniel, the way he had seen me, really seen me, in a way no one else ever had. What did it mean to be truly happy, to feel alive? Was it possible to have both without breaking everything in the process? Before I left, I wrote a letter. I wasn't sure who it was for, my husband Daniel or myself. but the act of writing it felt necessary. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for what happened, not because it was wrong, but because it revealed a truth I've been trying to ignore. I am not the person I thought I was. I'm flawed, messy, and full of contradictions. But I want to believe that I can find my way back to the person I want to be, whoever that is. I folded the letter and placed it in the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it. When I returned home, my husband was waiting for me, his face lighting up as I walked through the door. "Hey," he said, pulling me into a hug. "How was your day?" "Good," I said, smiling despite the ache in my chest. In that moment, I realized that the path forward wouldn't be easy. There were no guarantees, no tidy resolutions. But for now, I was willing to try, to rebuild, to rediscover, and to let myself feel, even when it hurt. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The camera pans out as the narrator stands on her porch, watching the sunset with her husband. The light casts a golden glow, blurring the edges of reality and memory. Her face is serene but contemplative, a hint of a smile playing on her lips as she whispers to herself, "One day at a time."